I never thought a book could break me. Not a gun, not a disease, not a divorce. A book. If someone had told me 10 years ago that I would one day sit in my living room in Chicago, holding a worn-out Bible with tears streaming down my face, I would have laughed right in their face. Because I didn't believe in God. Not a little, not secretly. Not I'm spiritual but not religious. I was an atheist. A proud atheist. And for most of my life, I thought faith was nothing more than a comforting story people told themselves because they were afraid of death. But then one night changed everything. One night that started with anger. One night that ended with me opening a Bible for the first time in decades. And what happened after that still gives me chills. My name is Michael. I'm 64 years old. I was born and raised in Chicago, Illinois, and this is the story of how an atheist found God when he wasn't even looking for him. Growing up, religion was never a major part of my life. My mother believed in God. My father didn't. Their arguments about faith were some of my earliest memories. I remember hearing them late at night while lying in bed. My mother would say, "One day you'll need him." My father would laugh. Need who? An invisible man in the sky? As a child, I didn't know who was right, but I noticed something. Whenever life got difficult, my mother prayed. Whenever life got difficult, my father worked harder. To me, my father seemed stronger, more practical, more logical. So as I grew older, I slowly adopted his worldview. Science explained things, facts explained things, faith explained nothing. At least that's what I believed. By the time I entered college, I had completely abandoned religion. I studied engineering. I loved logic. Numbers made sense. Equations made sense. God didn't. When professors discussed evolution, cosmology, and physics, I felt even more confident. The universe seemed understandable without God. Every answer I found appeared to push faith further away. I wasn't angry at Christians. I simply thought they were mistaken. Good people, kind people, but wrong. And for decades, that belief remained unchanged. I got married, built a career, bought a house in Chicago's western suburbs, raised 2 children, worked hard, paid taxes, did everything society tells you to do. From the outside, my life looked successful, but there was something nobody knew, not even my wife. There was a growing emptiness inside me, a quiet ache, one that became stronger every year. At first, I ignored it. Most people do. You distract yourself. Work, sports, television, vacations, social media, anything to avoid asking difficult questions. Questions like, why am I here? What happens when I die? Does any of this actually matter? Whenever those thoughts appeared, I pushed them away. I told myself they were philosophical nonsense. Life was simple. You live, you work, you die, the end. But deep down, that answer never satisfied me. Not really. Then life started taking things away. First, my father died, a heart attack, sudden, unexpected. One day he was there, the next day he wasn't. I remember standing beside his hospital bed, looking at his body, waiting to feel something profound, some understanding, some clarity. Instead, I felt confusion. How could a human life simply end? How could decades of memories vanish in a moment? Where did he go? The atheist in me said nowhere. The son in me desperately hoped otherwise. That contradiction haunted me for years. Then came retirement. Most people dream about retirement. I did too. For 40 years, I imagined freedom. No alarm clocks, no meetings, no deadlines, just peace. But when retirement finally arrived, something strange happened. The freedom I wanted became loneliness. The silence became unbearable. Days felt longer. Nights felt darker. For the first time in my life, I couldn't distract myself with work. I was left alone with my thoughts, and my thoughts weren't kind. I began asking questions I'd spent decades avoiding. What was the purpose of everything I'd done? What was I supposed to do now? Why did success feel so empty? The more I thought about it, the worse it became. Eventually, I slipped into depression. I didn't tell anyone. Men my age aren't supposed to talk about those things. We keep moving, keep smiling, keep pretending. But inside, I was falling apart. Then my marriage began to suffer. My wife noticed I was changing, becoming distant, irritable, withdrawn. She tried talking to me. I pushed her away. She suggested counseling. I refused. I thought I could fix myself. By 62, I felt more lost than I had at 22, and that terrified me. One evening, after another pointless argument with my wife, I walked out of the house. It was cold, typical Chicago winter. The wind cut through my jacket like a knife. I wandered through the neighborhood for nearly an hour. No destination, just walking, trying to outrun my thoughts. Eventually, I found myself standing in front of a small church. I don't even know why I stopped. I hadn't attended church in decades, yet something made me look at the illuminated cross above the entrance. A strange feeling washed over me. Not faith, not peace, just curiosity. For a moment, I considered walking inside. Then I laughed at myself. "What are you doing, Michael?" I turned around and went home, but I couldn't stop thinking about that church, or that cross, or why I'd stood there staring at it. Days passed, then weeks. The feeling remained. One afternoon, I mentioned it to my wife. To my surprise, she smiled. "I've been praying for you," she said. I rolled my eyes. Praying hasn't changed anything. She didn't argue. She simply said, "Maybe not yet." That sentence irritated me. Not because it was offensive, because it stayed in my head. Maybe not yet. A few months later, something happened that would completely alter the course of my life. My younger sister was diagnosed with cancer. Aggressive cancer. The kind doctors describe using words like advanced and limited options. When I heard the news, I felt helpless. For years, I'd trusted science to explain everything. Now science was telling me there wasn't much it could do. I visited her often, and every time I walked into her hospital room, I noticed something remarkable. She wasn't afraid. She should have been terrified. But she wasn't. She smiled. She joked. She comforted everyone else. One evening, while we sat alone, I finally asked her, "How are you so calm?" She looked at me. Then she pointed toward the Bible resting on her bedside table. "Because I know where I'm going." I felt frustrated. "No, seriously," she smiled. "I am serious." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me admired her. Part of me thought she was delusional. But another part of me, a part I didn't want to acknowledge, was jealous, because she possessed something I didn't. Hope. Real hope. The kind that remains even when everything else is falling apart. I drove home that night, unable to stop thinking about her answer. For the first time in my life, I wondered whether faith offered something I had completely misunderstood. Not intellectual answers. Something deeper. Something human. Something essential. A few weeks later, my sister gave me a gift. A Bible. I almost laughed. "Do you know who you're giving this to?" She nodded. "Exactly. I don't believe in any of this." "I know. Then why give it to me?" She smiled softly. "Because one day you'll open it." I thanked her, mostly to be polite. Then I placed the Bible on a shelf in my study and forgot about it, or at least I tried to, because every time I entered that room I saw it sitting there, waiting, silent, patient, month after month. And then came the night everything changed. The night I finally opened it. The night an atheist certainty began to crumble. The night I discovered that sometimes God reaches people in the places they least expect, including a 64-year-old skeptic sitting alone in a dark Chicago home. And what happened next is something I'll never forget for the rest of my life. The night began like dozens of other nights. Nothing extraordinary, nothing dramatic, no heavenly voices, no flashing lights, no miracles. Just me, alone and exhausted. It was a Thursday evening in late November. Chicago was buried under gray clouds. Rain tapped against the windows. The house felt unusually quiet. My wife had gone to spend the evening with our daughter. I told her I wasn't feeling well. The truth was, I didn't want company. Lately, I preferred being alone. At least that's what I kept telling myself. Around 7 o'clock, my phone rang. It was the hospital. My stomach tightened immediately. When hospitals call unexpectedly, it is rarely good news. A nurse informed me that my sister's condition had worsened. The cancer was spreading faster than expected. The doctors were concerned. I thanked her, hung up, and sat motionless in my chair. For several minutes, I stared at nothing. My mind was blank. Then anger arrived. The familiar anger that had been building inside me for years. Anger at life, anger at death. Anger at a universe that seemed indifferent to human suffering. I slammed my fist onto the kitchen table, hard. The sound echoed through the empty house. "What is the point?" I shouted. No one answered. Of course no one answered. No one ever did. I walked aimlessly through the house, past family photographs, past decades of memories, past the evidence of an entire life, and suddenly I realized something. None of it felt permanent. Every picture represented a moment already gone. Every memory was fading. Every person I loved would eventually disappear, including me. That realization hit harder than ever before. For years I had told myself death was natural, part of life, nothing to fear. But sitting there alone, I finally admitted the truth. I was terrified, not of dying, of nothingness, of ceasing to exist, of becoming a forgotten memory. I entered my study, turned on the lamp, and there it was, the Bible, still sitting on the shelf where my sister had placed it months earlier, waiting, silent, patient. I stared at it, then looked away, then looked back again. Something inside me resisted. Maybe pride, maybe stubbornness, maybe fear. For decades I had mocked religion. I had debated believers, dismissed faith, declared with certainty that God was a human invention. Opening that Bible felt like admitting defeat. Yet another voice inside me whispered something different. What do you have to lose? I walked toward the shelf, slowly, almost reluctantly. My hands felt strangely heavy. I picked up the Bible. Dust covered part of the cover. I laughed bitterly. Well, here we are. The room remained silent. I sat down, opened the cover, and began reading. At first I wasn't impressed. I expected some earth-shattering experience. Instead I found words, stories, names, genealogies, ancient places, ordinary pages. I read for 20 minutes, then 30. Nothing supernatural happened, no emotional breakthrough, no sudden revelation. Eventually I closed the book. See? I muttered. Just a book. I placed it on the desk and went to bed. But something strange happened. The next morning I couldn't stop thinking about what I had read. Not because it was convincing, because it was challenging. The words lingered, questions lingered, ideas lingered. Over breakfast I found myself remembering passages I had read only hours earlier. That evening I opened it again, then again the next day, and again the day after that. A habit began forming. At first I treated it like research, an investigation, an intellectual exercise. I wanted to understand why billions of people believed this book mattered. I expected to find contradictions, weak arguments, ancient superstition. Instead, I discovered something unexpected. The Bible seemed to understand human nature better than I did. Its descriptions of fear, pride, loneliness, brokenness, hope, they felt disturbingly accurate. Sometimes it felt as though the words were describing me. One night I came across a verse in the Gospel of Matthew. What good will it be for someone to gain the whole world yet forfeit their soul? I read it twice, then 3 times, then 10 times. Something about those words unsettled me, because they described my life. I had spent decades chasing success, building a career, accumulating possessions, achieving goals. Yet despite all of it, I remained empty. I couldn't explain why that verse bothered me so much, but it did. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, and little by little my certainty began cracking. Not collapsing, cracking, like ice beginning to thaw after a long winter. The more I read, the more questions emerged, questions I couldn't easily dismiss, questions that challenged assumptions I'd held for 40 years. One afternoon I visited my sister at the hospital. She looked weaker than before, much weaker, yet her smile remained. When she noticed the Bible under my arm, her eyes widened. "You opened it," I nodded. She smiled. Not triumphantly, not smugly, just happily, as if she had been expecting it all along. "What do you think?" she asked. I hesitated. "I don't know." She laughed softly. "That's a good start." Before leaving, she grabbed my hand. Her grip was surprisingly firm. Then she said something I will never forget. "Michael, God isn't afraid of your questions." I drove home thinking about those words. For most of my life, I assumed faith required blind acceptance. No questions, no doubts, no skepticism. But the people I encountered in Scripture seemed full of questions. They doubted, they struggled, they wrestled. Yet God met them anyway. That idea fascinated me. Months passed, Christmas arrived, then the New Year, and for the first time in decades I attended church. Not because I suddenly believed, because I was curious. The church was small, nothing fancy, no giant screens, no celebrity pastor, just ordinary people, families, retirees, young couples, teenagers, people from every walk of life. As I sat in the back row, something surprised me. These people seemed genuine, not perfect, not pretending, just sincere. For years I had imagined Christians as intellectually weak, yet many of them appeared thoughtful, kind, authentic. One elderly man introduced himself after the service. We spoke for nearly an hour. He listened more than he talked. When I finally admitted I was an atheist exploring faith, he didn't try to pressure me. He simply smiled. "You're welcome here." That kindness affected me more than any argument. Over the following months, I continued attending. Sometimes every week, sometimes every other week. I listened, observed, questioned, learned, and little by little something inside me began changing. Not overnight, not dramatically, slowly, like sunrise. One morning, while reading the Gospel of John, I encountered a verse that stopped me cold. The truth will set you free. I stared at those words for a long time, because despite all my confidence, despite all my certainty, despite all my years of skepticism, I wasn't free. I was burdened. Burdened by fear, burdened by regret, burdened by guilt, burdened by questions I couldn't answer. For the first time in my life, I wondered whether I had been wrong, not about everything, but about the most important thing. And that realization terrified me, because if God was real, everything changed. Everything. My understanding of life, my understanding of death, my understanding of purpose, my understanding of myself. The walls I had spent decades building were beginning to crack, and I wasn't sure whether I should be excited or afraid. I didn't know it then. But the moment that would completely transform my life was still ahead. A moment that would arrive unexpectedly, in the middle of the night, in a hospital room, beside the bed of a dying woman. The woman who first placed a Bible into the hands of an atheist, and what happened there would change me forever. The call came at 2:17 in the morning. I'll never forget the time. Some moments become permanently engraved into your memory. This was one of them. The phone rang beside my bed. The sharp sound cut through the darkness. My heart immediately began racing. I knew. Before I even answered, I knew. Hospitals don't call at 2 in the morning to share good news. I picked up the phone. A nurse spoke softly. "Mr. Thompson, I think you should come now." That's all she needed to say. Within minutes, I was dressed and driving through the empty streets of Chicago. Rain streaked across the windshield. Traffic lights changed for nobody. The city felt strangely silent, almost as if the entire world had stopped moving. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly they hurt. All I could think was, please don't let me be too late. Please, please, please. The hospital parking lot was nearly empty. I hurried through the entrance, past the reception desk, past the elevators, past hallways that smelled of disinfectant and exhaustion. When I reached her room, the door was slightly open. I stopped for a moment, afraid, not of what I would see, of what I would lose. Then I pushed the door open. My sister was awake, barely. The machines beside her beeped quietly. Her breathing was slow, weak, labored. Yet when she saw me, she smiled. The same smile, the smile she'd worn through months of suffering, months of chemotherapy, months of pain, months of uncertainty. A smile that made no sense, at least not to the version of me that existed a year earlier. I pulled a chair beside her bed. Neither of us spoke immediately. Words felt unnecessary. The room itself seemed sacred somehow, not because of religion, because life and death were standing in the same room, and both knew why they were there. After several minutes, she reached for my hand. I held hers carefully. Her skin felt fragile, paper-thin, yet her grip remained surprisingly steady. "You're reading it, aren't you?" she whispered. I knew exactly what she meant. "The Bible?" She nodded. "Yes." Her smile widened. For a moment she closed her eyes, as if hearing that answer brought her peace. Then she opened them again and looked directly into mine. "Michael." "Yeah?" "Promise me something." I swallowed hard. "Anything." "Keep searching." I tried to answer, but emotion tightened my throat. She continued speaking, slowly, carefully, every word costing her energy. "Don't stop because you're afraid." A tear rolled down my face. I quickly wiped it away. She noticed anyway. She always noticed everything. "You spent your whole life looking for truth." I nodded. "You just searched in the wrong places." Those words hit me harder than anything I'd heard in years, because deep down, I knew she was right. I had searched everywhere. Education, career, money, achievement, status, recognition. Yet none of them answered the questions that haunted me at night. None of them removed the emptiness. None of them gave me peace. For several minutes we sat together in silence. The monitors continued their steady rhythm. Outside the room, nurses moved quietly through the hallway. Inside, time seemed frozen. Then she said something that changed everything, something I still hear in my mind today. "Michael." Her voice was barely audible. I can see home." I frowned. "What do you mean?" A peaceful expression spread across her face, unlike anything I'd ever seen before. Not happiness, something deeper, something impossible to describe. "It feels close." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me wanted to argue, part of me wanted to explain it away. Medication, fatigue, hallucinations, anything. Yet another part of me sensed that this moment wasn't about explanations. It was about witnessing someone who wasn't afraid. Someone standing at the edge of eternity with more peace than most people have while healthy. She squeezed my hand, then looked upward, toward nothing visible, toward something I couldn't see, and she smiled. A genuine smile, a smile of recognition, a smile of anticipation, a smile that made the hair on my arms stand up. 20 minutes later she was gone, quietly, peacefully, without fear, without panic, without struggle. Gone. The room became silent. The machines changed their sounds. Nurses entered, doctors followed, procedures began. But I barely noticed. I sat there staring at the empty bed, trying to understand what I had just witnessed. My sister had just died. Yet the overwhelming emotion in that room wasn't despair, it was peace. And that confused me more than anything. I drove home before sunrise. The city was still dark. Rain continued falling. The windshield wipers moved back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, like a metronome marking the rhythm of grief. When I arrived home, my wife was waiting. She opened the door before I reached it. Without speaking, she wrapped her arms around me, and for the first time in years, I cried. Not politely, not quietly. I broke. Decades of emotion poured out. Grief, fear, regret, anger, questions, all of it. My wife held me as if she understood exactly what was happening. Maybe she did. Maybe she'd been waiting for this moment longer than I realized. Hours later, after she fell asleep on the couch from exhaustion, I found myself sitting alone in my study. The Bible rested on the desk, the same Bible my sister had given me, the same Bible I'd ignored for months, the same Bible that somehow kept finding its way back into my hands. Outside, dawn was beginning. The first hints of sunlight appeared beyond the clouds. I opened the Bible randomly, not looking for anything specific, just searching the way a thirsty man searches for water. My eyes landed on a passage I had never noticed before. "Come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." I read it once, then again, and suddenly something happened. Not a vision, not a voice, not a miracle, something quieter, something deeper. For the first time in my life, I stopped arguing, stopped analyzing, stopped debating, stopped demanding proof. I simply admitted the truth. I was weary, I was burdened, I was lost, and I couldn't fix myself. For 64 years I had trusted my own understanding, my own intellect, my own conclusions. Yet none of them had brought peace. None of them had healed the emptiness. None of them had answered the deepest questions of my heart. Tears began falling onto the pages. I didn't wipe them away. I didn't care. The room felt strangely still, as if the world had paused. And there, sitting alone in that chair, I spoke words I never imagined myself saying. Not aloud, barely above a whisper. But I said them. God. The word felt unfamiliar, almost awkward, yet it felt right. If you're real. I stopped. Emotion overwhelmed me. I took a deep breath, then continued. If you're real, I need you. The moment those words left my lips, something shifted inside me. Not around me, inside me. The fear I'd carried for years didn't disappear instantly. The grief remained, the questions remained, but something else appeared. Hope. Real hope. The same hope I had seen in my sister's eyes. The same peace I had witnessed in that hospital room. For the first time in decades, I wasn't alone with my questions. I wasn't alone at all. And as the morning sunlight slowly filled the room, I realized something astonishing. The Bible hadn't simply changed my mind, it had changed my heart. The atheist who opened that book months earlier wasn't the same man sitting in that chair now. Something new had begun, a journey, a relationship, a faith I never expected to find. And yet the greatest surprise wasn't that I had found God. The greatest surprise was discovering that He had been pursuing me all along. The days after that morning felt different. Not easier, different. That distinction matters. Because many people imagine faith as an instant solution to every problem. It wasn't. My sister was still gone. I still missed her every day. I still woke up some mornings wishing I could call her one more time. The grief remained. But grief no longer felt hopeless. For the first time, it carried expectation. The possibility that death wasn't the end. The possibility that goodbye wasn't forever. And that possibility changed everything. Over the next several months, I continued reading the Bible every day. Not because I felt obligated, because I wanted to. The book I once considered outdated suddenly felt alive. Passages I had ignored before seemed to speak directly into my life. Sometimes I would read a verse and sit quietly for 20 minutes thinking about it. Other times I would close the Bible and simply pray. That still felt strange at first. After all, I had spent decades believing nobody was listening. Now I found myself talking to God while driving, walking, sitting on the porch, even standing in line at the grocery store. And little by little, prayer became as natural as breathing. My wife noticed the change before anyone else. One evening, we were sitting together after dinner when she looked at me and smiled. "What?" I asked. She shook her head. "I haven't seen this version of you in years." "What version?" "The peaceful one." Her words caught me off guard, because I hadn't realized how much I had changed. For so long, I had carried invisible weight. Stress, fear, bitterness, pride, the constant pressure of trying to control everything. Now some of that burden was gone, not because life had become perfect, because I no longer believed everything depended on me. A few weeks later, I apologized to my wife, a real apology, not the shallow kind people offer to end an argument, the honest kind, the painful kind. I apologized for years of emotional distance, years of stubbornness, years of believing I always had to be right. She cried. Then I cried. Then we sat together holding hands like we had when we were young. It felt like discovering each other again. Looking back now, I believe faith saved more than my soul. It saved my marriage, because faith taught me humility, and humility opened doors that pride had kept locked for decades. Months later, something happened that I never expected. I decided to be baptized. Even writing those words still amazes me. If someone had told the younger version of Michael Thompson that he would one day stand in front of a church congregation and publicly declare his faith in Jesus Christ, I would have laughed until I couldn't breathe. Yet there I was, 64 years old, standing beside a baptism pool, nervous as a teenager. The pastor asked me a simple question. "Michael, have you placed your faith in Jesus Christ?" My voice shook. "Yes." The room erupted into applause, but I barely heard it. Because at that moment, I was thinking about my sister, the Bible she gave me, the prayers my wife prayed, the church I accidentally stopped in front of on a cold winter night, the countless moments that seemed random at the time, yet now appeared connected, like pieces of a puzzle finally fitting together. As I came out of the water, emotion overwhelmed me. Not because I felt perfect, I didn't. Not because all my questions were answered, they weren't. But because I knew my life belonged to something greater than myself. For decades I had searched for meaning. Now I understood where meaning came from. Not achievement, not wealth, not status, not success, but relationship with God. That realization transformed the way I viewed everything, including death, especially death. Before faith, death felt like a locked door, dark, cold, final. Now it felt different, still serious, still painful, but not final, more like a doorway than an ending. That belief changed the way I grieved my sister. Instead of focusing solely on her absence, I began remembering her hope, her courage, her peace. The peace that first made me question everything. The peace that ultimately led me to Christ. Years have passed since then. I'm 64 now as I tell this story from my home in Chicago. The same home where I once sat alone believing life had no ultimate purpose. The same study where I opened a Bible out of frustration and curiosity. The same room where I whispered, "If you're real, I need you." Sometimes I sit in that chair and think about how close I came to missing it. How close I came to remaining trapped in my certainty. How close I came to spending the rest of my life convinced that faith was for other people. I wonder how many others are where I once was. Successful on the outside, empty on the inside. Surrounded by people, yet lonely. Confident in public, terrified in private. Maybe you're one of them. Maybe that's why you're hearing this story. I don't know. What I do know is this. I spent 40 years demanding evidence while ignoring the deepest evidence of all. The longing in my own heart, the hunger for meaning, the desire for hope, the need for something greater than myself. For years I treated those desires as weaknesses. Now I see them differently. I believe they were invitations. Gentle invitations leading me toward the God I spent decades denying. If you had met me 10 years ago, you would have found a man absolutely certain God did not exist. Today you'll find a man absolutely grateful that he was wrong. Not because becoming a Christian made life perfect, because it gave purpose to suffering, meaning to existence, hope beyond death, and peace that no achievement ever provided. Sometimes people ask me what finally convinced me. Was it a specific argument, a scientific discovery, a philosophical debate? I always give the same answer. No, it was a Bible, a dying woman, and a God who refused to give up on me, even when I spent decades running in the opposite direction, especially then. And if there's one thing I hope you remember from my story, it's this. You may feel far from God. You may doubt, you may question, you may think you've gone too far, wandered too long, or become too skeptical. I thought all those things too. But I discovered something remarkable. God is still able to reach people who aren't looking for him. He reached a stubborn atheist in Chicago, a man who mocked faith, a man who trusted only himself, a man convinced he already had all the answers. And if he can reach someone like me, then perhaps he isn't finished with your story either. The Bible my sister gave me still sits on my desk today. The cover is worn now. The pages are marked. Certain passages are underlined so heavily they're nearly impossible to read. Every time I see it, I remember her words. One day you'll open it. She was right. I opened the Bible. But more importantly, the Bible opened me. And through its pages I found the one I never expected to find. The one who had been patiently waiting all along. The one who transformed an atheist's heart. The one who turned fear into hope. The one who made me believe that death is not the end. And when my own final day comes, I know exactly what I will remember. Not my career, not my accomplishments, not my failures. I will remember a rainy Chicago morning, a Bible lying open on a desk, a simple prayer whispered through tears, and the moment a 64-year-old atheist finally came home.